If you have red hair, you already know the reactions. Strangers ask if it's natural. People assume you have a temper, or freckles, or that you burn if you so much as glance at the sun. What almost nobody tells you is that your hair color is sitting on top of one of the more unusual stories in human genetics. A story involving a single gene switch, a pigment most people have never heard of, and a population bottleneck so tight that scientists can trace its outline in blood samples taken thousands of miles from where it began. Red hair is rare. Genuinely rare, not rare in the marketing sense. Only about 1 to 2% of the world's population has natural red hair, making it one of the rarest hair colors globally. That number holds up across most large population studies, and it puts red hair well behind blonde, which is itself uncommon outside Northern Europe. But average globally is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because red hair is not spread evenly across the planet. It clusters, hard, in one specific region, and understanding why it clusters there is really the whole story. Start with the gene itself, because red hair is one of the few visible human traits where scientists can point to a single gene and say, with real confidence, that's the one. It's called MC1R, short for melanocortin-1 receptor, and it's found on chromosome 16, where it provides the code for a protein that sits on the surface of pigment cells and determines which type of melanin those cells produce. Think of MC1R as a switch. When the receptor is activated, melanocytes produce eumelanin, the dark brown-black pigment responsible for brown and black hair. When the receptor sits idle, untriggered, those same cells default to producing pheomelanin instead, the red-yellow pigment behind red hair, fair skin, and freckles. Redheads aren't producing some exotic third pigment. They're producing the same reddish pigment brunettes and blondes have too, just in far greater concentration, because the gene that would normally push cells toward the dark pigment isn't doing its job. What breaks that switch is a set of mutations in MC1R itself. Genetic variation in MC1R is a known driver of red hair in humans, and researchers have identified specific loss-of-function changes in the gene, several of which are strongly linked to the trait. These aren't rare, exotic mutations found in a handful of families. They've circulated in human populations, particularly in Northern and Western Europe, for a very long time. And crucially, red hair behaves as a recessive trait in the way it's most commonly inherited. A person needs 2 altered copies of the gene, one from each parent, for the switch to fully misfire. If someone carries only a single copy, other hair colors tend to win out, and red hair does not appear. That's why the trait seems to skip generations in families. 2 brown-haired, non-red parents can each be silent carriers, and if their child inherits both copies, out comes a red-headed kid neither parent saw coming. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, though, and where the story of red hair stops being simple textbook recessive genetics and starts looking a lot more like the messy, layered picture scientists are used to seeing with complex traits. For a long time, red hair was treated as the clean, obvious exception to the rule that most human traits involve dozens of genes working together. 1 gene, 2 copies, red hair. Simple, except a landmark 2018 analysis of the UK Biobank, which looked at genetic data from over 340,000 people, found that the picture wasn't nearly that tidy. MC1R only explains about 73% of the heritability of red hair, and researchers found that most individuals carrying 2 MC1R variants associated with red hair actually end up with blonde or light brown hair instead, not red. In other words, having the red hair genes doesn't guarantee red hair at all. The same study found that while 93% of people who do have red hair carry 2 MC1R variants, that only accounts for a small fraction of all the people who carry 2 such variants. Most of them simply never turn red. So something else is finishing the job, or failing to. Researchers went looking, and they found it, at least partially, in a gene called ASIP. ASIP produces a protein that acts on the same MC1R receptor, but instead of leaving it switched off passively, it actively suppresses it. And researchers found that variants boosting ASIP expression in skin and hair follicles push melanocytes even further toward pheomelanin production, deepening red pigmentation. Add ASIP's contribution to MC1Rs, and the combined effect of the genes identified so far accounts for roughly 90% of the heritability of red hair. A big improvement, but still not the full picture. There's a real, measurable gap between carries the DNA associated with red hair and actually has red hair, and that gap is still being mapped gene by gene, the same way researchers have had to do with far more genetically tangled traits, like height or blonde hair, which involves the influence of well over 200 different genetic variants working in combination. Now to the geography, because this is where the human story sits on top of the biology. Red hair isn't just rare worldwide, it's concentrated with startling intensity in one corner of Europe. Ireland has the highest concentration of natural redheads on Earth, at around 10% of the population. Scotland comes next, at roughly 6%. Beyond those two countries, the trait also appears at meaningfully elevated rates among people with ancestry from England, Denmark, Iceland, and the Norwegian coast, a rough arc tracing the historic range of the peoples who occupied the British Isles and Scandinavia, going back thousands of years. Outside that arc, red hair thins out fast. It exists in small pockets elsewhere, parts of the Caucasus, scattered populations in Central Asia, isolated cases tied to ancient trade and migration routes. But nowhere else on the planet does it approach the density seen in Ireland and Scotland. Why there? The honest scientific answer involves a mix of genetic drift, geographic isolation, and possibly climate-driven selection, and it's less settled than the MC1R story itself. One piece of the puzzle is straightforward population genetics. In a relatively small, historically isolated founding population, like the peoples who settled the British Isles in prehistory, a recessive trait that happens to be present at even modest frequency can drift upward over generations, simply through the mechanics of who reproduces with whom in a limited gene pool, especially on an island where incoming genetic variation was historically limited by geography. Isolation concentrates whatever genetic variants happen to already be present, red hair included. The other piece is about sunlight, and it connects directly back to the biology of pheomelanin versus eumelanin. Eumelanin, the dark pigment, is a strong natural sunblock. It's why populations that evolved closer to the equator, under intense, near-constant UV exposure, carry high eumelanin levels in skin and hair as a protective adaptation. But that same protection becomes a liability somewhere like Northern Europe or the British Isles, where sunlight is weaker, more seasonal, and often filtered through heavy cloud cover for much of the year. Under those conditions, human skin needs to let in more UV radiation, not less, because sunlight triggers the body's own production of vitamin D, and chronic vitamin D deficiency carries serious health costs: weakened bones, compromised immune function, complications in pregnancy. A body that produces less eumelanin and more pheomelanin lets more of that limited northern sunlight through to the skin. In that light, the same MC1R mutations that produce red hair and pale, freckled skin may not have been a random passenger trait riding along for no reason. They may have carried a real survival advantage precisely in the low sunlight environments where they're now most concentrated, tracking a broader pattern seen with other light pigmentation traits that spread through northern populations over thousands of years. It's worth pausing on a myth that's attached itself to red hair almost as tightly as red hair has attached itself to Ireland: the idea that redheads got their coloring from Neanderthals. It's a good story. Human ancestors interbred with Neanderthals in Europe tens of thousands of years ago, so wouldn't it make sense that a distinctly European trait like red hair came along for the ride? Scientists actually tested this directly, and the answer turned out to be more interesting than the myth. In 2007, a team led by Carles Lalueza Fox at the University of Barcelona sequenced a fragment of the MC1R gene from 2 Neanderthal remains and found that both specimens carried a mutation that had never been observed in roughly 3,700 modern humans analyzed for comparison. Functional testing showed that this Neanderthal variant reduced MC1R activity enough to plausibly alter hair and skin pigmentation, suggesting Neanderthal populations varied in coloring much the way modern humans do, quite possibly including some genuine redheads among them. But, and this is the part the Neanderthal gene version of the story leaves out, the researchers specifically checked whether that Neanderthal mutation showed up in any of those thousands of modern human samples, including everyone involved in the excavation and lab work, to rule out contamination, and found it in none of them, indicating that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens arrived at red hair through separate mutations entirely. Two different species, facing broadly similar low sunlight environments in Ice Age Europe, independently broke the same genetic switch and landed on the same visible result. It's a textbook case of convergent evolution, not inheritance. Neanderthals had their own path to red hair, and modern redheads have theirs, and the two don't overlap in the DNA record, the way the popular version of the story likes to suggest. The MC1R mutations behind red hair don't stop at hair color either. They ripple outward into a whole cluster of traits that people with red hair will recognize immediately. Fair, easily burned skin and a tendency toward freckling are almost universal companions to red hair, and the mechanism is the same one driving the hair color itself. Because the same MC1R variants that push pigment production toward pheomelanin also reduce eumelanin output in the skin. And because eumelanin is the pigment primarily responsible for absorbing and blocking UV radiation, lower eumelanin levels leave the skin considerably more vulnerable to sun damage. This isn't just cosmetic. MC1R does more than direct pigment production. It also plays a role in DNA repair and helps maintain genomic integrity, both of which are major factors in cancer risk, so a malfunctioning MC1R leaves cells with less of that protective backup. There's even research showing that pheomelanin itself, the very pigment responsible for red hair, can contribute to DNA damage on its own, independent of sun exposure. And tumors in melanoma patients who carry red hair color variants have been found to carry significantly more DNA mutations than tumors in patients without those variants. It's a striking example of how a single gene, mutated in a way that produces something as seemingly cosmetic as hair color, reaches into far more consequential biological territory. There's also a long-running, genuinely interesting thread of research on redheads and pain and anesthesia, one of those claims that sounds like folklore, but has real data behind it. Multiple clinical studies have found that people with red hair and the associated MC1R variants tend to require meaningfully more general anesthesia to reach the same level of sedation compared to people without those variants. And separate research has pointed to altered pain sensitivity more broadly in redheads. The proposed mechanism ties back to MC1R's job description. The receptor isn't only expressed in skin and hair follicles, it also shows up in the brain, including in regions involved in processing pain signals. So a mutation that changes how the receptor behaves in pigment cells may plausibly be changing how it behaves in neural tissue too. It's a genuinely active area of study rather than settled fact. But it's one more thread connecting a single gene to a surprisingly wide web of physical differences that have nothing obviously to do with hair color on the surface. Put it all together, and red hair turns out to be a much richer story than recessive gene, rare trait. It's a single receptor gene on chromosome 16 that can be switched off by dozens of different mutations, working alongside supporting genes like ASIP that push the outcome further in one direction or another, still only explaining somewhere around 90% of why any given person ends up with red hair rather than blonde or brown. It's a trait that concentrated overwhelmingly in one small, historically isolated part of the world, likely through some combination of genetic drift in a limited population and a real adaptive advantage suited to weak, seasonal, cloud-filtered sunlight. It evolved at least twice, independently, in two different human species facing similar environmental pressures thousands of years apart, which is precisely why the popular idea that redheads inherited their coloring from Neanderthals turns out to be backward. Convergence, not inheritance. And it comes bundled with a cluster of related biological effects, from sun sensitivity to DNA repair to how the body responds to anesthesia, all traceable back to that same overworked, under-functioning receptor. Next time someone assumes red hair is a simple trick of genetics, a straightforward on-off switch passed down the family tree, it's worth remembering what the data actually shows. Even after more than 2 decades of genetic research narrowing in on the exact mutations involved, scientists still can't fully predict who will and won't end up a redhead just from looking at their DNA. About 1 in 50 people worldwide carries a color that traces back to a single stubborn gene, concentrated most densely on a set of islands at the edge of the Atlantic, shaped by isolation, sunlight, and evolutionary chance, and still, after all that mapping, not entirely resolved.